All right, welcome everybody to the Kentuckiana FileMaker Developers Group. This is our June session, and today we have Jesse Barnum of 360Works going to be talking to us about MirrorSync. So it's all yours, Jesse.
All right. So first of all, and I said this at the beginning, but I've had some more people come in. I really like feedback. I like questions. I like kind of making this more of a conversation than just me talking. So please feel free to jump in at any point. You don't need to hold questions for the end. It's not very fun if I'm the only one talking and I just am talking into the silence, into the void. So feel free to jump in and say stuff. How many of you guys have ever done a MirrorSync setup? I'm not sure what the best way is on Zoom to ask that question, but um, if you have done a MirrorSync setup, paste in the chat, and that just gives me an idea of I want to make this content relevant to everybody, and if a lot of people have done it, then I might skip certain parts of it.
You can do a raise hand in the reactions.
Oh, there we go. Reactions. All right. Okay. Clap, thumbs up, heart, joy, open mouth. Raise hand. All right. So I'll raise my hand. I've done a MirrorSync setup. So
Yeah.
It looks like nobody else has. So that helps me. That helps me figure out what we're doing. So I will there's Ron, what's my schedule like? Should I go for about an hour?
We've got 2 hours, but you can,
Okay.
So whatever we have left, we'll just have questions. And so you don't have to feel like you have to fill up the 2 hours, but you've got plenty of time to
I'm
work
not
with
sure I'm going to be able to hang out the whole time. So
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. There's a lot in MirrorSync, and I am not going to cover every aspect of it. In fact, I'm probably going to like kind of just skim through the kind of the most common ways that people use it. But this is where the Q&A comes in. Anytime that I'm talking about something and I'm not answering a question or I'm not diving into details on a section that you're interested in, just let me know and we'll just detour into that rabbit hole and figure it out. So, I'll keep it light and I'll just kind of keep it, as kind of just the basics. But I'm happy to jump into the details on anything. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. All right, and everything just moved around. Let me put everything back where I'm expecting it to be. All right, so you guys can all see my screen right now?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So I just did a session with Richard Carlton Consulting last week, and I used his FileMaker starting point solution as a base kind of example to show off MirrorSync. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to use FM starting point. And so since you guys have, I'm trying to figure out if I should show the setup process or just talk about the setup process. Let me show the setup process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring over my starting point database. This is a hosted server file. If you guys, a lot of people have used starting point, so you may already be familiar with it. If you're not, starting point it's a free kind of general business kind of CRM ERP system. Obviously it's not PeopleSoft or SAP or anything like that, but it's kind of just a free general business thing for invoices, contacts, projects, products, that kind of stuff. There's about 30 or so tables in it. Yeah, 33 tables. And I'm going to set up MirrorSync on pretty much about 30 of the tables. There's like 3 or 4 that are like single record preference tables and stuff that don't make sense to sync. So I think I like doing this rather than picking like the task management starter solution that comes with FileMaker that has like 2 tables in it, because nobody on this call is going to have a 2-table solution. So I think doing something like this is a fairly realistic example of what you might run into doing something for your clients. So I'm actually going to undo everything that I did half an hour before this, and just delete the stuff that I set up, and then I'll reset it up so you can see what the process looks like. So I'm just going to delete these scripts. I'm going to delete this layout. And I'm going to delete this table. Okay, and that pretty much puts me back to where I was before I started doing anything prepping to show this to you guys. All right, so now what you're looking at is pretty much starting point as it would look if you downloaded it from the website right now. There's been a few things that Richard and I did in the last couple days to kind of make this work better with MirrorSync. Like for instance, we set up host modification timestamps. We made sure all of his databases had creation timestamps, all of his tables rather. And we also did a fairly tedious thing that I'm going to show you right here, these sync layouts. All of these layouts, you need to have one layout for each table that you're syncing, and the layout can just be blank. So these layouts are really exciting. The important thing.
That's kind of, I have that standard on my, everything I write, because those blank layouts give me a place, a context to go to do something without having to load anything.
That's exactly right. That's all we need is we need some context to know that they're operating from. Notice that they all start with the word sync. That'll make more sense as I go through the demo. But basically, those blank layouts, it takes about 20 or 30 minutes. It's just tedious, boring. I don't want you to sit here and watch me create blank layouts. So that's the main part of the setup that I'm kind of glossing over, but it's not a complicated thing. So obviously that's something that. So I'm going to delete this configuration that I created. So MirrorSync has a few use cases, and I'm going to focus on the third one. The first one is clustering FileMaker servers or syncing between FileMaker servers. So you could have, let's say that you've got two FileMaker servers and you want to put them in a data center together and you want to load balance traffic between them. And you want to make it so that if one of the servers goes down, all the traffic immediately just kicks over to the second server that's running or vice versa. That's really sexy and cool. And I've demoed it several times before at DevCon. I'm not going to demo that now, but I've actually used FileMaker starting point for the same thing. So the same solution. The setup process for client to server syncs is the same as server to server sync. So what I'm going to show you, the process I'm going to show you would be identical if you're doing a server to server sync.
So this solves the roadblock a lot of companies have with FileMaker from that fact. There's no HAFT configuration for FileMaker, right?
Yeah, no, Claris has never had any concept of kind of enterprise high availability stuff and fault tolerance and everything like that. So this really, especially in combination with AWS, we do a lot of FileMaker hosting on AWS. I'm a big fan of AWS. I'm AWS certified, and where this works really, really well, if you're familiar at all with the load balancer feature of Amazon Web Services, the Elastic Load Balancer, you can set up a load balancer so it looks to all your users as if they're connecting to a single FileMaker server. You give them one host name and say, this is your FileMaker server. They connect to that address. And on the back end, what happens is that half of the users will kind of invisibly get sent to one FileMaker server, and half of the users will get sent to the other FileMaker server. And they're all working on one of the FileMaker servers, but they don't know or care which one they're working on. And if one of them goes down, Amazon's load balancer is smart enough to just connect all the other half of the users to the server that's up and running. It doesn't happen without downtime. So the users would get a thing saying your connection has been lost. But then when they go in and they say reconnect, they're just going to invisibly connect to the other server that's still running. So that's pretty slick. You can also use it for geographic distribution. We have some customers. We have one in particular. They're a Swedish company. They've got a server in Sweden, Japan, Sydney, and Los Angeles. And we're using MirrorSync to sync between all four of them. And that's really cool because, it's really slow to connect from Australia to Sweden. So this way everybody can have, fast access to FileMaker server. So that's kind of what I'll call use case number one, is syncing FileMaker server to FileMaker server. And it's not what I'm going to demo today, but like I said, the setup process for what I'm demoing is the same. Second use case would be FileMaker server to a non-FileMaker server. FileMaker server to MySQL, SQL Server, Oracle, DynamoDB, Redshift, Salesforce, or any JDBC compatible database. MirrorSync will sync FileMaker server with any of those things. It'll also sync without FileMaker server. So, we've actually done a couple things for the Department of Community Affairs where they were syncing an Oracle database to a SQL Server database, but I don't think that's what you guys are interested in. But that's really cool because FileMaker server, as you probably all know, is not like a beast from a web hosting standpoint. but it's really cool that you can build a FileMaker application with all of your logic in FileMaker and all of your admin in FileMaker and all of your user interface in FileMaker, and then just very simply publish it, sync it with a MySQL database or a DynamoDB database, and then build a web application that's running off of that SQL database, or in the case of Dynamo, a NoSQL database. And the transaction volumes are, off the charts compared to FileMaker. And even if the sync goes down, FileMaker's still working, SQL's still working. It just gets stale until you bring the sync back up. Or if you took FileMaker down to upgrade the operating system or something like that, you don't take your website down. Everything is still running on the website. My favorite example of that is DynamoDB. DynamoDB handles, at the peak of Prime Day, DynamoDB is what Amazon.com runs on. It's an AWS managed database. And at the peak of Prime Day last year, Amazon was running 82 million transactions per second on DynamoDB, like 82 million transactions per second. So basically, you don't ever have to think about capacity and scaling. It's just a non-issue. And it's really, really cool that MirrorSync lets you take kind of what is not a really high performance database like FileMaker and let you leverage a super high performance database without giving up any of the kind of the programming and the stuff that you're familiar with from FileMaker. You do have to build the web application, so that part doesn't happen automatically. But you just build a web application against one of these high performance databases, and it kind of removes FileMaker as the weak link in that chain. The third use case, which is what I'm going to demo today, is client to server. So you've got FileMaker Go or Pro running on a laptop, a desktop, an iPad, an iPhone, and you want to take a copy of that with you, and you want your salespeople or your field inspectors or your door-to-door people or your oil pipeline inspectors or your people who go out and build cell phone towers where by definition they have no cell service where they are. We had people who were digging for the remains of lost Roman legions in the deserts of Egypt that were using MirrorSync. And when they would find some bronze sword or something like that, they would take a picture of it in FileMaker Go on their phone. And at the end of the day, they would take it back to a tent and sync it up to a Mac Mini running FileMaker server with MirrorSync. So it's great for working offline. It's also great even if you're not offline, but you just want better performance. It's so fast to work on your own local copy of the database. Even if your database is not well architected, it's going to run pretty well when you're running it in a local copy on an iPad, an iPhone, or a laptop. So that's what MirrorSync is designed for. Now let me go ahead. So I'm going to jump in and show it to you guys. And before I get too far into it, you guys, any questions?
Not yet.
All right, cool. So these are
So far, good so far.
all right, cool. So I'm going to be talking about this FileMaker Pro client to FileMaker server. I actually skipped this use case because I only have 2 customers that are using it that I'm aware of, but it's interesting. You can sync a FileMaker client to a SQL database or web API bypassing FileMaker server. And that's an interesting case. You can sync FileMaker Go to SQL, FileMaker Go to Dynamo, FileMaker Go to MySQL, and not have FileMaker server sitting in between. You need FileMaker server during the configuration process, but after configuration, you can actually build a FileMaker Go front end to a non-FileMaker server backend, which is kind of cool and actually very, very fast. So I'm going to create a FileMaker client to server sync. I'm going to call it FileMaker starting point, FMSP. Here we're telling it, so MirrorSync uses the terminology hub and spoke. Hub is your FileMaker server, or in a server to server sync, it's your main server. It's the one that if you were going to delete all your copies of the database and keep just one, which one is that one? That's your hub. So this is, what is my hub server? And I forgot an important thing. So we just introduced MirrorSync 6.5 last week. The big news with MirrorSync 6.5 is that it now runs on natively on M1 Macs and Linux. And it runs not only on Intel Linux, but if you're hosting on AWS, it runs on the G series, which is the ARM chips, which are cheaper and faster that Amazon uses. So if you're running FileMaker Server 2023 on Linux on the ARM series on AWS, you'll be able to install MirrorSync on that box now. There's basically as far as installation goes, it's just like FileMaker Server. you SSH into the box, you download the FileMaker installer package, and then you run a command line thing that just walks you through a little text-based set of prompts to install FileMaker or to install MirrorSync on your Linux box. So I am running this on an AWS Linux box, running Ubuntu 22. And so we put in our FileMaker server credentials, sorry, our FileMaker database credentials, then our FileMaker server credentials. Then we pick which database we want to sync. These are all my databases on my Linux box. I'm going to pick this FM starting point database. We go to our next screen. This is the most, this is the part that you just watched me delete before I get started. This is kind of pretty much the whole MirrorSync setup process, this screen. It's 4 steps. What we do is MirrorSync comes with a database. Let me put this over on the screen. MirrorSync comes with a database called MirrorSync support. So you open up your MirrorSync support database, and sorry, I've got all this stuff on 2 monitors. Let me bring everything over where it's supposed to go. So this is the support database, and you're just going to basically do a bunch of copy and paste operations from here. And then let me get to my starting point database. That's this guy. And something I always like to check, a cool little trick, you may probably already know this, but if I'm not sure whether a database is hosted or not, I go to the file menu, and if my save a copy as is disabled, I know this is hosted. This is not an offline copy. So that's how I know this is running on FileMaker server. So this is my hosted database that I'm going to configure. This is my support database that I'm going to copy and paste from. I'm going to follow these steps. So step 1, copy the MirrorSync table into the database. So I come into here, I copy this, I come over to my FileMaker starting point database, I paste it, hit OK. And something that's neat is that in this screen, this is live, you'll get check marks as you do each step. So you know that you've gotten them done completely. So step 2 is copy the MirrorSync folder from the MirrorSync support database. This is a script folder. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to grab my MirrorSync folder, copy it. I'm going to come back to starting point. And I'm going to paste it. I have noticed when I'm doing these setups, oh, actually that was really fast. Usually these copy and paste operations take a little while, but I'm happy that it's fast. And then rename the MirrorSync 6 script to MirrorSync 6 FMSP. So I'm going to rename that. And you can see immediately it's detected that I've copied that and pasted that in. I've renamed it. I get my little green check mark. This is giving me a little caution sign saying the sync URL does not match. So in your database, edit the MirrorSync 6 script, which is where I am right here. Near the top of the script, find this script step, set variable MirrorSync URL, and then we need to copy and paste this into that line. So that's right here. MirrorSync URL. We're going to paste our URL into that. I'm going to save that. When I save that, I get my green check mark, so I know that's working. And then step 4 is copy the MirrorSync layout contents from the MirrorSync support database, go to the existing MirrorSync layout and delete everything on it, and then paste it. So let's do that. Copy, layout mode, switch to the MirrorSync layout. This got created when I pasted in the table occurrence. I'm going to delete everything, and I'm going to paste. Oh, my window's not quite wide enough. There we go. And if I shrink this up, it just resizes nicely. Okay, so I've got all my check marks. That was pretty much, you just saw the MirrorSync configuration process. That was basically all we need to do to the FileMaker database, other than creating those blank layouts, which I mentioned earlier. There's some optional steps that you can do. That MirrorSync script that I pasted, that is how the MirrorSync process runs. It's just a regular FileMaker script. There's nothing, there's no plugins, there's no extensions, there's no native code. You don't need to bundle this with iOS SDK. There's no code anywhere. It's just a regular FileMaker script. You trigger it just like you would a FileMaker script. So an optional step, which I'm not going to bother with right now, is that you could stick a button or something on here so that users can do it. For now, I'm just going to run it from the scripts menu. I'm not actually going to run it yet. I'm not ready to, but so that's an optional step that you would just make it a little bit more user friendly by sticking that button on there somewhere. A few more optional steps about running the sync when you first start. And here's an optional step about, and this one I am going to look at because I think Ron, you told me you were interested in this, is filtering the records so that each user only gets their own stuff. So that's this last thing. If you would like to limit the records that are synced from the hub to the spoke, take a look at the lower section of the MirrorSync 6 script that contains script comments which explain how to accomplish this. So let's take a quick look at that. So here's my MirrorSync script. There's actually 3 scripts in the folder, but this MirrorSync 6 is the one that you might customize. I'm going to scroll down and you'll see a bunch of comments right here, customization instructions. And so there's basically 2 parameters that you get passed. Which database, which is either the word hub or the word spoke. So hub is what will run the MirrorSync, for the customization that happens on the server side, which database will be set to hub. For customizations that run on the spoke, which database will be set to spoke. It's still the same script. It's just the which database changes depending whether they're on FileMaker Go or FileMaker Server. And then which action. We call this script to do a bunch of different things, and you can customize what happens for each one of these different actions. The one that we're interested in here is find changes. So find changes is the first one. So here, which database is hub, which action is find changes. And then I won't read all of these comments here, but basically this is just plain old vanilla FileMaker scripting that you do here to control who gets what. What a very important thing is that the get account name function is going to return the name of the logged in user. That's your key to figure out who gets what. So here's a commented out example. I'm going to uncomment it and just talk through it. So basically you want to start off with an if statement because the same script is going to get called for all of your sync layouts. So you'll want to have an if statement to make sure you're customizing each layout appropriately. So you can check the layout name. You enter find mode. You just do whatever you need to do based on the account name to get the records for that user. You can search across related hop across relationships, whatever you want there. And then you do constrain found set. You want to do constrain found set and not perform find because MirrorSync will already have limited these records to recently modified records, and you're further filtering it to just the recently modified records for a particular user. You might do things here like, for instance, only sync records that have a creation timestamp in the last 30 days, or only sync records whose status is active, or only sync records where the geography, the zip code that user is assigned to matches the geography and zip code of the customers that they are paired with in a join table. Use your imagination, whatever you want to do there. Anything that you could do at a FileMaker find, you can do in MirrorSync. Anything that does not match the criteria will actually get removed from the user's iPad. It won't just not get synced, it will actually get removed. So don't look at this as a performance optimization. Don't look at this in terms of like, oh, I don't want to sync these records because I know they haven't changed. You don't need to worry about that. MirrorSync is already going to take care of only syncing the records that change. You would only modify this if you specifically want to remove certain records from the user's iPad or laptop. So, which works out really well. Yeah.
So I just want to get that straight because I really like that. In the use case that I mentioned to you before we started it was, different a sales force that are working on different projects. So for instance, they could get synced to any of the projects that they're actively working on. But once that project is switched to no longer active, then it would then remove those records from their local file.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and
one of the things I had also kind of wondered about MirrorSync and using that type of thing is, if you've got an employee and you've got they've got a set of records on their mobile device. Well, what if they get fired or they, and then they're still walking away with all these records in there. So especially if you're accumulating over time,
yes,
and these records remain on there. So I love that that
Yeah.
feature that basically says only the active records will remain on that device. So yeah, that's
Yeah,
great.
so keeping that list of active records they have trimmed down to just the stuff they need for their immediate task, I think is
Yeah.
going to be really important. Keep in mind, obviously, you can't reach out and pull and delete records from the system.
Right.
This is only going to delete if they click the sync button.
Right.
But yeah, you can keep that list real tidy so that they're not just going to have like every customer that has ever been worked on by anybody in your business
Exactly.
sitting on their iPad. Yeah.
Jesse,
Yeah.
quick question. First of all, great to see you again.
You too, Stephen.
Hey, building on this idea of syncing, but syncing remotely, I do a fair amount of work with government organizations and schools, and there's been this epicenter of ransomware attacks over the last couple of years. Would this be a good way of creating arm's length or disconnected databases so that if you have a ransomware attack on your primary server, that doesn't migrate to another server where the file becomes encrypted?
I think well, I mean, encrypting the file, yes, because if the file is encrypted, that's going to break it and the sync will no longer work. And then your a secondary copy of the database is going to be intact.
Okay.
I think what we do for our hosting customers to protect against ransomware is we do an AWS level snapshot.
Mhm.
And the snapshots, it's tricky to get the snapshots right because you can't snapshot live hosted FileMaker databases. So you need to do this little dance that's hard to time because FileMaker Server Admin is not 100% reliable. But basically, you need to pause the databases, run the snapshot, and resume the databases. The
Mhm.
cool thing with AWS snapshots is that once you trigger the snapshot operation, it's immediately safe to resume the databases. Like you don't need to wait for that snapshot to finish, basically. So I like the snapshots approach. And what we do is we keep 7 days rolling snapshots.
Mhm.
The other thing that I like about that as a ransomware protection, better than say MirrorSync, is that a very knowledgeable attacker could
Will delay,
potentially
won't they?
do subtle things to your database that would then be synced to your backup copy.
Mhm.
If they encrypted the files, then yeah, that would be really in your face and obvious, and it would just break and the sync would stop working. You'd have your extra copy. But if they did something more subtle, like deleting, uh, certain records over a certain dollar amount or something like that, or just even if they simply deleted all the records, if they deleted all the records, MirrorSync is going to delete all those records on the other side of it as well. So it would protect against certain kinds of attack, but not others.
Mhm.
That's why I feel like the snapshot approach. The other thing I really love about the snapshot approach is that it originates from outside the box. So there's no credentials that get stored on the box. If somebody RDP'd into the box, there's not like a text file sitting on the desktop that says, here's the password to like log into your backups or something like that. Like there's nothing that lives on the box that an attacker could look at. It's triggered from external to the
Mhm.
box. But I do think that so while I don't think that it's the ideal way to protect against ransomware, I think it's a great way to protect against just failures.
Mhm.
If your FileMaker server A goes down, MirrorSync is a really ideal way to have a very hot spare that's running and ready to go on server B. That, it's not like an hourly backup that first of all takes time and slows you down, and second of all could be up to an hour old. I would say run MirrorSync every 60 seconds, and you're going to get very little load on the server because there's not many changes that happen within a 60-second span. And it's really fresh. So if your one server goes down, you're losing at most 59 seconds worth of data.
Mhm.
And that's pretty livable.
Mhm.
So I think that would be where MirrorSync would be ideal as far as like a protection thing. It's more protect against failures than protect against malicious attacks.
Mhm. And the snapshot rate on AWS can be what?
The rate, when you say
Yeah.
do you mean the price or do you mean the speed?
No, no, the speed. I mean, how many of them can you take economically?
A lot.
Oh, okay.
The pricing on snapshots is really cool because snapshots are incremental. So
Mhm.
you could run one snapshot per minute and you could run it all night long. are all, you could run it from, let's say, 5 p.m. to 9 a.m. and create thousands of snapshots. And if the database hadn't changed during that time, they would take up 0 kilobytes of data and there would be no cost to you. So you can, now, I mean, it is possible certainly to run up a bill on snapshots if large chunks of the database change and you're snapshotting it frequently. But it's really cool that AWS is smart enough to look at your drives at a block level and only copy the 4K blocks that have changed. And it does that, like I said, in the background. So it's not like FileMaker server backups. I mean, FileMaker server does do backups in the background. That's true. But it's putting a performance hit on the box the whole time that it's running, as opposed to AWS snapshots, which are triggered from outside FileMaker server. And once they're triggered, there's nothing that's happening on the CPU or the RAM or anything like that of your box. It's all happening on an AWS provided, hardware. From a cost standpoint, per gigabyte, I think snapshots actually cost slightly more than online storage, but because of their incremental nature and also because of the fact that they're automatically compressed, your actual billing for snapshots usually winds up being pretty reasonable.
Cool.
And it depends a lot on how many changes you make. If you had a huge amount of external container fields that were routinely being deleted and re-added, that would add up to a lot of snapshot storage and a lot of cost.
Gotcha.
Okay, so this was kind of our main process where we actually did anything to our FileMaker database. In fact, I don't think I need to do anything else to FileMaker at all anymore. This next screen here is basically walking you through the setup process of creating those blank layouts that you saw that we already created. It is important that you have 3 fields, and you guys probably already have all 3 of these fields in all your tables. You need a primary key, number 1. You need a creation timestamp, number 2. You need a modification timestamp, number 3. I'm guessing you guys already have all those. Where you might need to add a new field is, depending on time zone issues, it might be helpful to create a host modification timestamp. MirrorSync will take care of automatically adjusting for time zones if your mobile users go to different time zones. But MirrorSync cannot help in the case of people connecting directly to FileMaker server from different time zones. So if you had a server in Kentucky in Central Time and somebody connected to it from San Francisco right now, it's 12:36 for you guys. If somebody in San Francisco modified one of your records, their modification timestamp would be 10:36 a.m. And FileMaker doesn't store time zones. So MirrorSync would look to MirrorSync like this record was modified 2 hours ago, and MirrorSync would not detect that as a change. So that's just something to be aware of, is if you do have users connecting to FileMaker server directly from outside, then you'll need to create a host modification timestamp. And we have a little documentation section on that later. You don't need to worry about mobile users. So if your mobile user goes to San Francisco and they edit and create records from a San Francisco time zone, MirrorSync knows about that and it can adjust for that. Going to our next screen. Now we get to the Spoke database configuration. You can pick between your FileMaker client credentials, which is basically saying each user logs in with their own password, as opposed to this, which is all users share a single password. Obviously, individual passwords are better, but this is sometimes more convenient if you have 1,000 users. I'm skipping a few of these options. I'll just briefly mention you can sync with a separate mobile file. So if you have a big, legacy database that's like a 30-file multi-file solution that's existed since 1992, and you don't want to try to put that onto the user's iPad, you can create a separate trimmed down mobile light version of that database. Ideally, a single file mobile database, because it's a lot easier to work with single file solutions on iPad and iPhone. And then you could host that file on your FileMaker server as a separate database, and MirrorSync would then sync that separate mobile file to the hosted server file. And you can map up the field names and the table names in case they don't match. Now
Can
we
you
get
run that by me again? What is it's creating the light mobile version of the file, and then
it's not creating anything for you. But if you wanted to take a big legacy database that was sprawling and huge, and you wanted to create yourself, MirrorSync won't do this part for you.
Right.
But if you created a stripped down light version that maybe had 10 tables instead of 100,
gotcha.
and one file instead of 50, and only had the fields in it that you wanted to sync, and it was like really nice for, you know, all of the mobile Go stuff with portrait and layout landscapes and
Yeah.
iBeacons and everything else like that. MirrorSync, what MirrorSync does for you is it will allow you to map your fields and map your tables between that mobile version of your database and your hosted version of the database, so that MirrorSync can sync between them, even though they're not copies of each other.
Okay. So it's kind of like the file on the mobile device would sync to the light version, and then the light version would sync to the server.
Yep. So on the server, it would be indistinguishable whether this record was created on the server or whether it was created on the mobile light version and then synced up to the server.
Okay.
This is, now we get into the layout selection screen, and MirrorSync thinks in terms of layouts, not really in terms of tables, at least when FileMaker does, with FileMaker it does. So you have a choice here, and you can say, I want to sync this table, or this layout, and this layout. Or what I'm going to do is you can say sync any layout that starts with the word sync underscore. And now you can see why we named all those layouts the way that we did, because now it's just going to automatically pick up all of these layouts without us having to check the box for every single one of them. And a really cool side effect of this is that if you had a new table that you added to your solution next month, you wouldn't even need to go into the MirrorSync setup process at all. You would just create a new layout for that table, make sure you name it sync underscore something. MirrorSync will automatically detect that when a user syncs with it, and it'll just include that table automatically as part of the sync. So you don't need to come back into MirrorSync and reconfigure it every time you add a table or a field, because the MirrorSync will detect all of the layouts to start with sync, and it'll detect all the fields that are on those layouts. Back in MirrorSync 5 days, and by the way, this is, I should have hit next while I was talking because this takes about 2 minutes. There's there's like 31 tables here, and what MirrorSync is doing right now is, if I were to show you my terminal window, this is my Linux box. I'll just for grins, I'll show this to you. So this is FileMaker Server, and we're hitting it pretty hard, 98% CPU. And what we're doing right now is we're going to each of those layouts and we're creating a dummy test record. And then we're attempting to set every field in every table to see which fields are editable and which fields are not. We also use that to detect which fields are your auto-entered modification timestamps, your auto-enter creation timestamps, which fields look like primary keys. Does it look like they're serial numbers or UUIDs? So we're kind of doing this empirical testing process, table by table, to see, you know, what we can change and what all the schema metadata is for those. One of these days, now that they recently made, there's that script step, save a copy as XML, and that has all the data that we need. But until recently, that was not a server compatible script step. Now that it is, I anticipate at some point converting to use that, and I think we'll probably get much more accurate information as well as much faster information. But for now, we just kind of create a dummy record in each table. And you may notice that, by the way, if you have serial numbers, you may notice that a serial number gets used up during this process, because we do create and delete a record as part of that. We have to commit the record as several times as well. Now we get to, this is where you're really kind of making some choices about how you want the sync to work. So the first thing is you can give it an email address. And now if any failures happen during the sync, it'll send me an email, so I'll know that something went wrong. I can also pick, I can say, I'd like to get emails about failures or warnings, a summary of any sync that has changes. I want to see a list of all the IDs that changed. And you can get super granular and even get an email every time a sync runs, even if there's no changes. This would be super annoying, but you could maybe do it during development just to make sure everything's working. You can also set it to no emails if you don't want to get anything. This is that time zone option. Remember I talked about directly connected non-syncing users accessing FileMaker Server from different time zones. If the answer is no, then you can use regular modification timestamps. If the example is yes, and in this case it is yes, because my Linux server happens to be running in Virginia, which is an hour ahead of you guys in Kentucky. And so I would say yes here, and then it doesn't change anything. It just tells me to look at this section of the which I've already done in FM starting point. So FM starting point is, if we just, I can just show you, if we just grab a table at random and we say date modified timestamp host, all it is just a case statement. And there's a lot of different shortcuts you can use, but I like the case statement. Basically, this says anytime this regular date modified changes, then drop the current host modification timestamp into this field. So every time anything is changed on this record, this will store the time that it was modified on the host. And that way MirrorSync won't miss changes if they were made in a time zone that's west of the server. We get now down into sync directions. Do we want to sync bidirectional, which is what I have it on now? Do we want it to sync one way from hub to spoke? You know, that way might be relevant if you wanted some read-only reference data that people could carry out into the field to have with them at all times, but they're not making changes. You could do this one way from spoke to hub. That would be a data collection scenario where you have field inspectors and things like that. I have field inspectors are probably 50% of the customers for MirrorSync, people who inspect gas pipelines, oil pipelines, house chimneys. You know, anytime that people are doing inspections, a lot of those people use MirrorSync. So that would be this kind of scenario where you're just creating and gathering data in the field and pushing it up to the server. I'll keep this in bidirectional for now. Now we get into primary key matching, and this one takes a bit to explain. Developer managed is easier to explain, so I'm going to explain it first. Developer managed is basically if you're using UUIDs. If you're using UUIDs, everything is really simple. The primary key on this device, that record syncs to the server, the primary key stays the same because it's guaranteed to not be conflicting with any primary keys that exist on the server. So we don't need to worry about primary keys stepping on each other's toes and overlapping each other. We call it developer managed because you, the developer, are responsible for making sure that your primary keys are unique across all devices. There's kind of cockamamie schemes you can come up with that I've seen people do where they like use people's initials or just like numeric ranges that are, you know, you get record 1 million through 2 million, you get 2 million through 3 million, whatever. I really just think UUIDs are the way to go. Like they just solve the problem really well. But however you choose to do it, as long as you make sure that your serial numbers or your primary keys on all the different tables, all the different devices are not going to be the same as any other devices, then pick this developer managed option. MirrorSync managed is a really interesting thing, and I don't know of any sync solutions at all, not just for FileMaker, but at all in any industry that do this. What MirrorSync managed does is it makes it so you can use serial numbers as your primary keys. Serial numbers are fundamentally very difficult to use for syncing solution because, you know, if I create record 100 and I sync it to the server and it gets record number 100 on the server, and then Ron creates record 101 and he syncs it to the server, or he creates record, I'm sorry, I messed up Mike's. So there's records 1 through 100 on the server. Ron and I both get a copy of the database. I create record 101. I sync it. Now there's 101 on the server. Ron also creates a new record. His is 101 as well, because it's on his device, 101 is his next number. Now he goes and syncs that to the server. If we just simply wrote 101 as the new record, we would either overwrite my record, which would be bad, or we would have 2 records with 101, which is also bad. So what we do instead is MirrorSync will allow the server to assign the next number, which is going to be 102. And then MirrorSync internally keeps track of the fact that Ron's record 101 in table such and such goes with server's record 102, and Jesse's 101 goes with server 101, and Bev's 101 goes with server 103, and Steven's 101 goes with server's 104, etc. And so all of those mappings are kept internally by MirrorSync, and it's really pretty complicated keeping all the stuff because then you need to also deal with foreign keys. So MirrorSync will also rewrite the foreign keys as it goes, and it'll order the record so that it syncs the parent records before the children records, so it knows what the foreign key is of the parent when it's going to write the children. And sometimes you have circular dependencies where A depends on B and B depends on C and C depends on A, and then MirrorSync will do multiple passes to make sure that they're done correctly. It's really complicated, but you don't see any of that. Like it just works really well. So it does work fine with serial numbers, and it works really well with, it's not just for serial numbers, it's also for databases like Salesforce. We sync really well with Salesforce. Salesforce doesn't allow you to assign primary keys. You can only create a new record, but you can't assign a primary key. So that creates That's difficult for most sync solutions to deal with because they expect to be able to set the primary key in the thing they're writing to. Because MirrorSync was made to work with serial numbers in FileMaker, it just happens to also work really well with databases like Salesforce that don't let you assign primary keys when you write them. So I'm going to pick, that was a very long-winded explanation. The short answer is, if you're using serial numbers, pick MirrorSync Managed. If you're using UUIDs, pick Developer Managed. We're using UUIDs and FM starting point, so I'm going to pick Developer Managed. Does that make sense? Because I know I don't always explain that really well.
Yeah, it made sense. And it also
Yep.
it was also an important consideration with the project we were recently considering, because the project did not have UUIDs, and we were wondering if that was going to be a deal breaker.
Yeah, it's not. Now, there is a different thing to consider. I'm going to talk about it though when I get to the next screen and we talk about write back columns. But the short answer is MirrorSync will work fine with serial numbers. Then we get down to field selection. If we say sync all the fields in the table, then that's why these layouts are blank, is because we don't need to know what fields you want. We're just going to sync everything. We're going to skip calcs, summaries, and globals, but we're going to sync every other field that we find in the table. You also have this choice, sync only fields in the layout. If you have 100 fields in your table, but there's only 6 of them that you care about syncing, instead of creating a blank layout, you would create a layout with those 6 fields on it, and then you'd pick this option, and MirrorSync would just only do those 6 fields. I haven't demonstrated field merging yet, so this will make more sense when I get to there. But basically, you can turn field merging off or on here. I also haven't demonstrated conflict resolution. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I will talk about it when I get to that part of the demo. The last thing I'll talk about before I leave this screen is this checkbox right here, same settings for all tables. If I uncheck that box, this looks like a whole different UI, but it's actually the same choices that I was just showing you, but it's just per table. So I could say for notes, that's read only this way, and for estimates, that's read only this way. And and for this one, I only want to sync the fields in this layout. And for this one, I don't want to do conflict merging. So you can change all of these settings as necessary on an individual basis, which would be really actually pretty common if you want to control the sync direction. There's a lot of times that people say, I want these tables to sync both directions, but these are reference only tables that the users in the field should never modify. I want them to be one way from hub to spoke. So I will set this back to same settings for all tables, but I want you guys to know that you can change all these settings on an individual table basis. Now here, I'm going to click refresh one time because my write backs sometimes don't work. So let me talk about what's happening here. These are all of my layouts. MirrorSync has automatically detected the primary keys. Remember this thing that I'm doing right now where it refreshes the table data. It's going through and trying to figure out which is the primary keys. I would highly recommend setting unique validation on your primary keys. Not only is it just good from the standpoint of data validation, but it makes it really easy for MirrorSync to know which fields are primary keys. It's an optional primary key field 2, which you might use if you have a join table, and the join table doesn't have its own primary key, but it has basically multiple foreign keys that are kind of collectively a compound primary key. You can do that. Then you've got the modification timestamp. Notice that all of these are date modified timestamp _ host. MirrorSync can't really tell the difference very well between which is a regular modification timestamp and which is the host modification timestamp. But if it sees the word host in the name of the field, it will assume that that's the one it should use. So I name these. If I didn't have that name in here, I could still pick it from the pull. I can't do it right now because I've got a modal dialog up, but you could pick what the name is of your host modification timestamp. And then every field needs a creation timestamp. And then the write back value, which I'm waiting for that to pop up. But the write back value, that's another one that takes a little bit of explanation. So let's go back to the question about, can it work with serial numbers? The answer is yes, MirrorSync will sync serial numbers. But here's the big but. Where you run into the problem is that the users can see those serial numbers. So if you have a purchase order number or a work order number or a check number or an invoice number or a job number or anything along those lines, remember the example that I gave, my record 101 on when I sync it to the server is going to be 101. But if Ron syncs record 101 on the server, it's 102, and Ron calls up and says, hey, can you please take a look at invoice number 101? They're going to see my invoice and they're going to be like, well, what are you talking about, Ron? And so, so that isn't fundamentally a syncing issue. It's
But you-
more of,
But you get a sinking feeling.
yeah. Nice, Bev. It's really a kind of just a best practices issue. It's really not a best practice to have your primary key be something that users can see, because the second they can see it, they're going to care about it, and the second they care about it, they're going to want to change it. And when they want to change it, you're going to be in a world of hurt.
Yeah.
So it's really a best practice in general to separate your fields into a primary key field which the users can't see, and a user visible field which they can see. And then if you need to change that user visible field, it's not going to break all your relationships when you do it. So that is the one hitch you may run into when you're talking about, we had a legacy system that had serial numbers. What you would want to do in that case is you would want to go through that legacy system and see how many cases there are of where your serial number primary key fields are visible to the user on a layout or a search or something like that. And in those cases, create a new field for the user visible field that that is called work order number or check number or something like that, and then modify those layouts and scripts to point to that new field instead of the primary key field. And that brings us back to this column right here, this write back column. So the purpose of the write back column, so let's take this invoices table, for instance. We've got the ID invoice, which is a UUID, it's the primary key. And then we have this ID invoice display, which is a serial number. And so that's basically going to be, when you create an invoice number, an FM starting point on a mobile copy of the database, let's say that, Ron creates record 101, that's his invoice number. He syncs it up to FileMaker server. FileMaker server is going to assign the next serial number to that ID invoice display, which is 102, and then it will write it back. That's why we call this the write back value. MirrorSync will write that back to Ron's mobile copy so that Ron will have 101, and then after his first sync, he'll have 102. And everybody everybody can sync the records. They'll have a temporary value until the first time the record is synced, and then they will get the next sequential number that everybody is kind of using a continuous sequence number from on the server.
Wow.
What I kind of like to do to make that a little bit more user friendly is I do an auto entered calculation where I make it so that I make it so the field is blank if it's created on the offline copy. You can use the get multi-user state. If get multi-user state is 2, then you're on the server. If it's not 2, then you're on the offline copy. So I do an auto entered calc that says if the get user multi-state is not equal to 2, just do blank. And that way, instead of a wrong number that changes the right number, it's a blank value that changes at the right value. But that's what the write back fields are for, is so that you can have these user visible serial numbers that will all kind of share a single uninterrupted sequence that's the same for everybody once they've synced their records the first time. That's probably the biggest hitch that we run into, by the way. When we talk to people and they call us and they're like, hey, I like MirrorSync, I want to use it. The biggest problem that we run into, and it's not a problem, I should rephrase it. The biggest task that we have when we're configuring a database for MirrorSync is to help them create new user visible serial numbers instead of using their primary keys on those things. So that's a common thing that we run into.
I had a quick question about the host modification timestamp.
Yeah.
So in a system that does not have a host modification field, when you add it, then presumably all those records that you've added that field don't have a value if they've not modified. Do you have to somehow go back and populate those or modify them somehow so that those have a value? Or
no, you don't. It's a great question. And it's something that I ran into when I was doing the development on it. And it's okay for those to be blank. Basically what MirrorSync says is it does a search for all records modified on or after, and that will automatically skip over all the ones that are blank, which kind of by definition have not been modified since at least the time that you configured MirrorSync. So we're automatically going to not do anything with the blank values, which is the desired behavior. So it's okay to create that field. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a big question on, how do if I have to add fields, any of the auto enter fields, if I have to add them after the fact,
I'm glad that you said
how do we justify any of those
Yeah.
when you're
Right.
syncing. So that's great. Thank
I'm
you.
glad you asked that question because I don't get that question very often, and I'm going to add it to the list of things I make sure to mention. You don't need to populate new modification timestamp fields. Yeah, that'll the next group that I talk to will benefit from that question because I'll be sure to I'll be sure to bring that up.
One of those that comes from my experience of having a database with several million records and having to add a
Replace
field
field
and then
contents.
populate those values over several million records is not
And
a small task. So
speaking of which, that is the surest sign to hose your sync.
yeah,
Is if you have a
yeah.
million record database and then you do replace field contents on the entire set of records, you can pretty much assume that it's going to take several days per
Yeah.
user
Yeah.
for the syncs to complete. Because MirrorSync is going to try to write all a million updates to each user, and so that's when somebody gets when somebody sends us a support ticket, they're like, "We've been using MirrorSync for 3 years. It's been working great, and all of a sudden it's super slow." I always know why. It's
Yeah.
because somebody ran a looping script or replace field contents that went through a huge table and modified all the records in that table.
Yeah, and that kind of brings up a question about if there's any way to, work around that, keep the modification timestamp from changing because that happens from time to time. Like I've have other functions that have run into the same problem. It's relying on a modification timestamp, and then I had to run some kind of utility script that went through to change
Yes.
the values on a huge subset of records, and now I've got this huge subset now with the that I've got
Yeah.
to deal with.
I have cheated on that from time to time and temporarily turned off the modification timestamp and then done my replace operation and then forget to turn the modification timestamp back on. so yeah, that's you can cheat.
Yeah.
Of course, your changes are not going to sync, but that's your intention if you're doing
Right.
that is to make sure that they don't sync.
Yeah.
The other thing that you could potentially do instead of cheating like that is you could coordinate that with just a new rollout of your offline copies to your users. You could say, hey guys, it's Saturday, throw your copy away, get a new copy on Monday.
Yeah.
Because when MirrorSync does when it makes that initial copy and puts it on the user's device, it will look for all records modified in the last 25 hours before they did it. So if you're going to do that huge operation, try to do it maybe Friday night or Saturday morning. And then Monday morning, when they go and they get a new offline copy, that initial sync will run pretty quickly because it'll look back 25 hours from when they get their copy of the file, and there won't be any changes in that time.
And so there's a mechanism then for having a file available for the user to acquire that's
Yes, I will hold that question. I'm going to show you
okay.
the download URL. And in fact, if you guys feel like it, I'll send you guys the download URL. We can all try it. Or everybody can mess with it. These foreign key fields, MirrorSync will detect them for you automatically. It reads your relationship graph. It uses the design functions to query the relationship graph and figure out which fields relate to what. It doesn't just do it based on the table occurrence attached to your layout. It also finds the base table and looks at all table occurrences that share that same base table to discover all the foreign keys that relate to that. It is important for MirrorSync to know about your foreign keys. In the case of MirrorSync managed keys, it's critically important because if it doesn't, it won't rewrite the foreign keys and all of your
Right.
record relationships will be broken. Even if you're using UUIDs, it's still really good for MirrorSync to know about your foreign keys because it changes the order that things happen in. That's how MirrorSync knows which tables are parent tables and which are children tables. And it tries to sync parents before children so you don't get orphan records. And it tries to delete children records before parents so you don't trigger cascading deletes. It also changes the order that fields get written in so that auto-enter fields get triggered in the right sequence so that they don't get overwritten by default values. For some reason, I don't know why, a lot of people like to wipe all of these out. They actually click remove on every single one of them. Like, I didn't want to worry about it. So don't do that. This next screen is a read-only screen that just it's mocked up to look like the FileMaker relationship graph. It's actually interactive, although it's kind of messy. But it's mocked up to look like the FileMaker relationship graph, so you can just skim over it and make sure that MirrorSync didn't miss any of the foreign keys or detect additional relationships that it wasn't supposed to get.
Oh, wow.
I'm a little OCD, so it's always really tempting to sit here and like straighten out all of these things so there's no crisscrossing lines, but I'm not going to subject you guys to that. This last screen, this is if you would select additional databases if you had a multi-file solution. I don't recommend using multi-file solutions with iOS. iOS does not deal well with zip files. I would only do this feature if you were syncing with laptops. Laptops will be fine with a zip file. iOS is not. So if you had a multi-file solution and you were syncing with laptops in the field, you could pick this option right here, and you could say, this is my interface file, and this is my data file, and this is some utility file, and this is an additional file. And then when we get to, and Ron, to get to your question about this download facility, which I'm going to show you, when you trigger a download in MirrorSync, it will take all 4 of these files, zip them up, and send them down to you so you can decompress the zip file. But it is definitely cleaner to have a single file solution for syncing purposes. And that's it. That's this dialog popped up on my other screen. So that's the whole setup process. As you can see, I mean, all I did in FileMaker was paste a table, paste some scripts, paste a layout, and create a bunch of blank layouts, which you didn't see me create the blank layouts, but that, you know, that doesn't take a lot of imagination. So that is all that had to be done in FileMaker for this configuration to be ready to go. Now I'm going to actually show you the syncing process. And I'm going to click this download database. So somehow or another, at this point, you need to get a copy of this file to your mobile users for them to sync it. So there's the old school way. You close the FileMaker and FileMaker server admin, or you get a backup copy, you download it, you email it to them, Dropbox it, flash drive, whatever it is that you're going to do, iTunes sync cable. But MirrorSync gives you a really cool feature that is a lot nicer. If you do this download database, you can just download it here. And that's just a convenience cover for basically doing the same thing that you would have done in the server admin console, but then you still need to send the file to your users. What I recommend instead that you do is you use this create link option. So you create link, and now you have a choice of either downloading a full copy or an empty clone. Full copy is what you should use if you pretty much want everybody to have a full copy with all the records in it from the server. Empty clone is what you should probably use if you're using filtering, and each user is only going to get 5% of the total number of records on the server. Full copy actually often is a little bit faster to sync because we're not actually having to write any records. The records will already match what's on the server, but it creates a really big file. Empty clone might take a little bit longer because you're actually having to insert all the records on that initial sync to their device instead of just copying them over. But if you're filtering the records tightly and they're only getting maybe 100 or 1,000 records, it's not going to take that long. If they're getting 50,000 records, it might take an hour or two. If they're getting 1 million records, I would find a different way besides the empty clone option. And then you've got this choice here, run initial sync. This is a feature that was added in MirrorSync 6. You can run the sync on their initial sync can either run on the client device, which basically means that if you pick empty clone and client device, what's going to happen is they're going to get an empty clone, they're going to click sync, and their iPad or iPhone is going to download all those records and insert it, which is kind of straightforward. It's what you'd expect. But there's this cool option that we have here of server. And in that case, what happens is MirrorSync creates the empty clone. Before sending it to the user, it hosts it temporarily on FileMaker server. So you have your main file and this temp hosted copy. And then it runs basically a server to server sync while applying the filters for that user from your main file to your temporary hosted copy. Then it closes that temporary hosted copy, renames it back to what it's supposed to be named, gzips it, and sends it down to the user so that they don't have to like download all those things over like an LTE cellular connection and wait for their iPhone or something like that to run it. So it's much faster.
Yeah, that's nice.
I'm going to do full copy client device because in this case, I'm not doing any filtering. And so now the download URL has been copied to your clipboard. You can use the revoke feature to prevent it from working in the future. If you paid close attention in that download thing, there was a button that said revoke. You would use that, Ron, to your point, if somebody was fired from the company and they had your download URL and you don't want them to be able to get copies of the database anymore,
Right.
you'd want to be sure to go in and click that revoke button, and then you would issue a new URL to the users that are authorized to have it.
Gotcha.
So I'm going to click OK here. That just puts something on my clipboard. I'll show it to you. Here's what that URL looks like. It's the general MirrorSync download, and then DB download. We're doing a client-side initial sync, and then here's a UUID so that it's not guessable to anybody. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to go drag a browser window over here. I'm going to paste that long URL. And this is all happening really quickly, but there's a lot that happens under the hood when we do this. We're using the FileMaker Server Admin API to get a copy of that, to run a backup copy of that database. There is no Server Admin API function to generate a backup copy. You can only run schedules. So actually what we do is we create a schedule on the fly. We then run that schedule. I can see Steven laughing. It is such a hack. We create the schedule, then we run the schedule, then we get rid of the schedule, and then we go and we get the results of that schedule. We gzip it and we send it down to you. So it happened fast, but that's actually what was happening behind the hood. And here's the file that just got created. I'm going to use the username and password MirrorSync, all one word, capital M, capital S. Same for the password. I'm telling you guys that because if you guys want, I'm going to have you download your own copies too. And now this is getting a little confusing. I got a lot on my screen now, but I'm just going to use my little shortcut I showed you. In this copy of the file on the upper left part of my screen, save a copy as is grayed out. So I know this is my server copy. Over here, the bottom right version, I've got save a copy. So I know this is my offline local copy of the database. And I'm on a 15-inch laptop screen, and I'm starting to get confused with what's going on. So I'm going to move my camera over to my other monitor. But so now I've got a client copy and I've got a server copy. Now these have not been synced yet. So I'm going to come up to here and I'm going to run my MirrorSync script. And everything's popping up on my other monitor. So I got to drag it all over here. This is your first sync from this device. It's asking me for the name of this device. That's basically for the administrator to get status messages. I'm going to hit OK, establishing contact. It's asking me for my password. I've already opened the FileMaker file with my username and password, but now I need to provide the username and password in order to connect into the the hosted server. We only need to enter it once. MirrorSync will tokenize this and store it for future reference, and it'll store that token in the file, so it won't ask the user every time they go to sync for their password.
Cool.
So this initial sync runs, and it's a little bit hard to see in the background there. I've got too much on my screen, but there's actually the MirrorSync setup thing in the background here is also humming along to indicate that stuff is happening. Sorry, there's just so many things on this little screen that I can't show them all at the same time. But it just finished. That took 46 seconds. It added one record. It added a record, by the way, and I didn't create any record. So why did it add that record? It's in the audit log table. The way Starting Point works is that every time you open the database, it creates a record in the audit log table. So that's kind of cool when you think about it. We didn't do any scripting to like tell us about the audit log table. We didn't even need to know about the audit log table. It was just one of our layouts that had the sync prefix on it. So MirrorSync just treats it like anything else, and anything that gets modified in any tables is just going to get picked up automatically. So that was my initial sync. Now I'm going to make these a little smaller so you can see my MirrorSync status in the background a little better. This is my support file that I did all the copying and pasting from. I don't need this anymore, so I'm going to close this. I'm going to make these a little smaller. I haven't made any changes yet. I'm going to run another sync. These keep popping up on the other window. And these run really fast. Now I've done my incremental sync. This takes 2 seconds. These no change syncs every time on the other monitor. These no change syncs are taking about 2 seconds. That's not bad. I'm in Atlanta. My server's in Virginia. 2 seconds is how long it's taking basically to go to all 33 layouts, check all of them to see if any records have been modified. Do that both on the client and the server. Compare all of them and see that nothing was changed. So now let's start making some changes. So I'm going to go to the context layout on both. So I got my server on my left, my offline copy on my right. I'm going to create a new record. Create Jesse Barnum. That's all I'm going to do for now. I'm going to run a sync. I'll drag the thing over. And we added one record to the sync contacts. And now looking at my hosted file, there's my Jesse Barnum record. So that's the
Cool.
sync working.
Very
Now,
nice.
I'm going to change it on the server, and it should update. I just did an insert. Now I'm going to test an update. Change this here. Come back to here. Run my sync. I'm not even going to bother dragging that window over anymore. I'll just tell you guys how long it takes. All right. That took 2.246 seconds. That did not change it. I wonder if that has to do with time zones. That should have done that. That's odd. Let me see if it's.
Did
Is the
it
record
get committed
committed?
after you changed it? or-
No, it didn't, Bev.
Oh.
That's what it was. I didn't click out of the record completely. Thank you. This is why I love you guys not being on mute. There you go. That's what it was.
Yeah.
So that modified the record on my offline copy. And now I've got that there. So now let's get into, so we've seen that inserts work. We've seen that updates work. Let's talk about conflicts. So I am going to set a phone number on my offline copy. And I'm going to actually commit the record. Then I'm going to come here and I'm going to change my website address on the same record on the server copy, and I will commit that. I'm going to run my sync. Okay, and let's look at our status window closely here. So it modified the record on both the hub and it modified the record on the spoke, and it took 3.68 seconds. And we can see here it merged those changes together. So it took my phone number and my website, and it saw that I made one of them in one and one in the other. And it
Cool.
does that by doing a three-way merge. It knows, thanks, Bev. It knows what the contents were the last time it was in the server. It knows what the contents were the last time it was on the client. This is a little complex because when I changed it here and there, all it really knows is that these records don't match, but it doesn't really know who changed what. It just knows that they don't match. So it goes to an audit log database that we create separately to compare the server's version of it with the server's last version of it and the client's version with the client's last version of it. And that's how it knows that which field was changed on which device. Now we're going to do a real conflict where I'm going to change the same record, same field on the same record. So now we run our sync. And now we get to a conflict dialog. At this point, MirrorSync can't solve this problem for us. It doesn't know which one is the right one. It can't merge it because it's the same field. So it needs some human interaction at this point. So one thing we could do is we could cancel the sync and everything would just keep working and we could resolve it later and we could go along with our business. So we don't have to resolve it right now, but I'm going to go ahead and resolve it. That pops open a conflict resolution dialog. And you can see in the conflict resolution dialog, we get a color-coded thing showing which fields are in conflict as the email address. I'm going to click into this row. It shows me here's my server copy, here's my local copy, when it was last modified, when that was last modified. I see the email address. I see these other fields are not in conflict, so I can see exactly which fields have the conflict, and I say, oh, that was the personal email. I really meant to pick the work email. I'm going to pick that work email by picking that arrow to say I want the server version. And now I say finished, and then it says your selections have been saved to the server. Close this window and rerun your sync. Close that. I jump back to FileMaker. So I should get Jesse at 360Works in both of these when I run this now. Okay, and looks like it did both the spoke and the hub. And that I get Jesse in both of them. So that is the conflict resolution process. So what we just kind of saw was basically a walkthrough. The only thing we haven't done yet is deletions. But before I move on to deletions, which are the least boring part of the demo, but the hardest part of this whole thing to write, so what we saw there is that we can insert in either direction, we can update in either direction, we can modify both records at the same time. If different fields are modified, MirrorSync is going to merge those fields together. If the same field is modified in both, then we get into a conflict. And this is where I kind of glossed over some of those options on that screen that I mentioned. I'm going to talk about some other conflict resolution options. What I just demoed for you is the default behavior, which we call user picks. It's called user picks because the user is picking which version of the conflict to keep. The user who's doing the syncing is the one picking the conflict resolution. There's also a last right wins concept, which is not the same as last sync wins. And that's important. It's not whoever syncs last wins. It's whoever modified the record later than anybody else after adjusting for time zones. The presumption there being that, hopefully if me and somebody else are both modifying the same record, I'm talking to them and I'm saying, oh, make it this. And so whoever makes it that last is the one that should be kept. So that's called the most recent change wins option. There is an option which I never recommend, but somebody asked me for it, so I did it, which is hub always wins, which I think is a bad idea. But you
Yeah,
can
it
make
is.
it so, yeah, it's
It's a bad idea.
yes. If you have some bizarre reason for wanting to, you can make it so that whatever's on the server always beats whatever is on the offline device. But like I said, don't do that. And then there's a cool option, which is admin picks, which is the same as user picks, but instead of the user picking that, an administrator gets an email sent to them with a link that they can click to get that same web-based conflict resolution screen. And then the admin can say, oh, well, this is the correct information for this particular record. If you don't trust your users, to deal with that conflict resolution process. So those are your 4 different ways for resolving conflicts in MirrorSync. Before I run out of time here, I want to do something kind of fun. I'm going to go into
Can I
Zoom.
ask a question right quick?
Before you ask the question, I'm going to do something that is going to take a second, and then I will come back to that question. So hang on just a sec. I'm pasting this download URL in the chat. If anybody just is bored and wants to try this, you're welcome to click that download URL, download your own copy of the same database that I'm working on, and we can all experiment with stuff. If you want to create some records in there, you can delete me or deface my name or whatever you feel like doing.
Yeah. Is there a particular version needing to be used?
This should work with FileMaker 18 or later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I haven't upgraded my OS and I can't get to past 19.4 or 19.5.
That'll be fine. That'll be fine. Who had the question?
Oh, that'd be me. And
Okay.
this is may not have an absolute answer, but when you just went over that last major section of the syncing, my mind went curiously to what do you suspect like when you get support calls, is that like one of the major things, or is this going to happen once in a blue moon? In my mind, I think it's once in a blue moon.
It's really, really rare, actually, that we get support calls about conflict resolutions. People just get it. They figure it out. I get a lot of MirrorSync support tickets, and I am actually the one who personally answers almost all the MirrorSync support tickets. And I can't think of one recently, maybe ever, where someone's like, I don't understand conflict resolution. I don't get how it works.
Well, that's kind of nice to hear, because then it lets us database people know that that's not going to be probably, what I mean.
Yeah, something to overly worry about. Yeah. So while you guys are downloading those offline copies, I'm going to demonstrate deletions. It's not a very exciting demo. Let's create a new record here. Let's sync it. Let's look at our server copy. There's delete me. And now I'm going to follow the instructions in the name, delete the record. And then I'm going to run the sync. And that record gets deleted. That is That's really hard to make that work, especially efficiently, because you can't query FileMaker and say, find all the records that have been deleted.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to get the list of primary keys and compare them. And what we do in MirrorSync, there's what we call a fast delete scan and a slow delete scan. And the fast delete scan is where we sort the records by reverse creation order, and we assume it's more likely that you've deleted a recently created record than an old one. So rather than exhaustively go through the entire list of keys and compare them to what we know to expect on your device and what we actually find on your device, we do kind of like a streaming reverse sorted uh, iteration, and we find gaps in there, and those gaps are where we know that records have been deleted. And so it works efficiently even with millions of records, as long as the records being deleted are fairly recent. If you have a million record table and you delete your oldest record, MirrorSync will find it, but it might take a little while for it to find it. So that's all the basic operations of MirrorSync. I've got a couple little optional features to show you guys, but let me pause for a minute and see if I see Bev's running a sync right now. Any questions before I keep going? All right.
I had
Quick, Jesse. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. What is the account name and password for the file?
Sorry, I should have posted that in the chat.
Yeah.
it was MirrorSync, wasn't it? Just,
It is.
yeah. So I had a couple of questions.
Yeah, hit me.
So how does anything to know about if the records contain images?
Yeah,
Files?
so images sync just like any other field. We use something interesting about images and bandwidth is that MirrorSync does a very interesting way of talking to FileMaker Server. It uses the data API to talk to FileMaker Server, but it doesn't use the data API in a way that any Claris person would ever recognize. It uses the data API by basically kicking off a script, and then the script uses the insert from URL for all the communication back and forth to the MirrorSync application. So we're not actually retrieving data through the data API. We're just using it as a glorified script launcher. And then the insert from URL is what does all the communication. So a nice thing when FileMaker 16 came out is they added the ability to send binary data in the insert from URL command. So we can now just do very straightforward HTTP puts with container fields to send the binary data. We used to, prior to FileMaker 16, we used to have to base 64 decode, or encode rather, the containers, which makes them 37% bigger, and then we have to send them up, and then base 64 decode them, and it was a real pain in the ass and it was real slow. So recent versions of FileMaker Server and MirrorSync are really very efficient now at transferring container fields. They just go like any container field. They go basically as fast as your bandwidth will allow. There is an important note, kind of a performance optimization tip I would give you when it comes to container fields. Let's say that you've got a table that has 100 fields in it and 10 container fields. Like you're doing a car rental agency thing and you want to take photos of the car from like 10 different angles. I would not recommend putting all 100 fields and all 10 containers in one table. The problem that you'll run into is that anytime you change any of those fields, like if you change one of those text fields from like date checkout completed or customer sign off or anything, MirrorSync syncs on a per record basis, not a per field basis.
So it's going to
MirrorSync is then going to sync all 100 fields and all 10 container fields, and when you change any one of those fields. So what I would recommend is either what's good would be to take those 10 container fields and put them in their own separate table, so you can modify the text data without having to also upload the container data. But what's even better is take those 10 container fields and put them in a single record, basically images table, where each container field is its own record. And then if you reshoot the front quarter panel of the car, you're only uploading that one container, not 10 containers. So the more you can segment container data into their own individual tables, or preferably even own individual records, the less wasteful pushes you'll have of container data going back and forth. But it works just fine. There is something to be aware of with container data when you have externally stored container data.
Mhm.
Yeah,
iOS cannot deal with externally stored container data. FileMaker
Yeah.
Pro can. So if you are giving this copy of your database to people on laptops, you're good. The download URL that I showed you will actually download a zip, and the zip will contain both the FileMaker file and the RC data with all the external container data. But if you download it to iOS, you're just going to get the FileMaker file. So all your containers are going to be broken. A lot of the times that's not as big of a problem as it sounds, because a lot of people are only syncing containers from Spoke to Hub. At least that's what I've found. A lot of my users of MirrorSync are doing field inspections. So they're just taking pictures in the field and they're syncing them up. They don't care about getting
Yeah.
images from the server down. But if you do care, if you need to have, charts and schematics and blueprints and PDFs because you're doing like a boiler room checklist of something like that, then you'll need to find a way to approach that problem. Call me if you want to talk about different strategies to do that, because there's a lot of different ways to solve that problem. None of them are terrific,
Yeah,
but there's a lot of tips I can give you on how to do that.
that is something that would come up with, my primary employer, that the system that we've talked about doing some kind of syncing solution, but it's selling advertisement. And so part of that would be being able to show if it was like an in-person visit, being able to show that JPEG of the advertisement on the mobile
Right.
device. So
one of the many strategies for dealing with this that might work well for your specific case would be our super container product. So super container is a little bit long in the tooth, and in many ways, many of its functions have been folded into the core FileMaker functions. But there's certain things that super container still does better than FileMaker, and that's one of them. So what you could do is, if you were to store those JPEGs for those ad things using super container, now all you're syncing back and forth is a URL. And then, assuming that you have at least some network connectivity when you're at the client's office, you could have an offline copy of the database, quickly search things, navigate to records, etc. And then you could have a web viewer using super container that would just get the JPEG from the web instead of having it be downloaded as a container field. That's not the only option. Call me if you want to talk about other choices.
I was
but that would
thinking
be
probably a simple option, because it wouldn't necessarily have to be high resolution. Now, the ads themselves are like 300 DPI, high resolution, but could do a calculation field that creates a thumbnail.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because the use case would be basically just so that the person could see the layout of the ad. Like, they're not going to scrutinize the
right.
fine details and all that kind of stuff. So as long as they had a decent image that they could look at, that would be perfectly acceptable. So I think that would probably be the solution for my use case. It's just
Now you still need to figure out how to get those containers over there.
Yeah.
Whether they're big or small, they're going to be broken when you first make a full copy.
Yeah.
FileMaker has if you open up that file, there's a file menu and save. There's an option to save a self-contained copy.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, and I filed a bug with FileMaker about this, and I haven't tested it recently, but I assume it's still broken in my opinion. When you save a self-contained copy, FileMaker updates the modification timestamp of every record that has a container field in it. So it merges that container data so that it's internally stored, but it changes the modification timestamp, which is okay for a small database, but for a big database, that's going to make your very first sync write every single record, because they're going to look like they were all just recently modified. Another option, another way to deal with this is that if you're giving empty clones to your users, then on their initial sync, even if it's set to use external storage, on their initial sync, when it goes to pull those records from FileMaker server into your iOS copy, they will get stored internally embedded, because iOS can't do external storage.
Yeah.
So that's another way to solve that problem. If that's not a good solution if you have 100,000 containers, because your initial sync is going to take really, really long. But if you've got 100 containers, especially if they're thumbnails, that might be a good choice, and especially if you're using record filtering, where you're like, this account exec is only assigned to these 8 clients, and so we just need the graphics and the artwork for these 8 clients.
So that leads to my question: can you then sync just those 8 clients?
Yes.
Not the whole database. Okay.
Yes. This is Bev. This is the part I was showing where I was customizing that MirrorSync 6 script.
Yeah.
If you were to go into the script workspace here.
Yeah.
Down in this section, the find changes, what I would do is I would say, if get layout name equals sync add graphics, enter find mode, set field, and I would have a join table between, I would have a many relationship between clients and account execs. And I
Yeah,
would have a field in that join table that contained the account exec's username.
right.
And I would pick that join table. I don't know what, I'm just going to pick a random thing here. And I would hopefully have an account name field.
So yeah, so it basically through that relationship, because it's constraining,
Yes.
it would only sync those. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Cool.
So
Very
now
cool.
I'm only going to get, and actually I would probably do this for multiple layouts because
Yeah,
I don't want to
yeah,
just do it for the graphics. I want to do it for the client record and the jobs record and all that kind of stuff. And the cool thing
yeah,
is, depending on how your layout table occurrences are set up, a lot of the times, if your layouts, and we had a kind of a pre kind of conversation with Kirk about, having small table occurrence graphs and stuff like that, table occurrence groups. But if these layouts were all connected and they had the same connected table occurrences at each other, you could actually just use the same exact set field, as long as all of your other layouts had the same valid table occurrence path to get to the join table that had your assignments. You wouldn't even need to change the field that you were searching in from one table to another if they all had an interconnected graph,
yeah,
which maybe isn't great for performance reasons like we were talking about, but it would be really convenient as far as like being able to filter all of these tables off of the same set of criteria.
cool.
So I've got one last thing I'm going to demo, and then we'll see what questions you guys have. But the last thing I'm going to talk about is version changes. So now you guys all have the solution, and it
I
looks like
just wanted to point out, especially for viewers of the video later on, it's pretty neat. You see how many of us all added records to.
Yeah.
We've all been
Yeah.
adding ourselves to
And
the
then
contact
we have
table.
to go back and sync to make sure you got them all.
Yeah.
So,
So everyone's connected live. You guys, has anybody run into trouble, by the way? Has anyone had any
No,
problems with syncing?
no,
no.
It's all been pretty smooth. It runs fairly fast.
I've
Yeah.
got a Python quit unexpectedly error here. What's that? Or
What did it
might
say? Sorry, Stephen, I couldn't hear you.
Python unexpectedly quit, or Python quit unexpectedly.
That's not us. We don't do, there's no Python code in MirrorSync. So whatever that is, it's something unrelated.
Okay.
I'm not sure what's happening there.
Click on me and see if my profile picture synced.
Let's see.
Who put the Fred Smith record in?
That was me, Bev
Have to
Allen.
scroll to the. Yep, there it is.
All right, here we
He's
go.
not a FileMaker developer anymore.
Yeah, we got you. We got your photo here.
Yeah.
Nobody else was brave enough to put a picture.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, give me back. Give me a break.
All right, so let's talk about version updates. So you guys all have these copies of the databases, and now I'm the developer on this database. And remember, my hosted copy is on the left. So I'm looking at my hosted copy and I'm like, it sure would be nice if we had a button to run the sync instead of having to run the sync menu. So I'm going to go grab one of these guys. I'm going to create a button. I think there's. Oh, it's just give me a beach ball for a second. That looks good. Let's change. So remember, MirrorSync is just a regular script. We can trigger it like we would any other script. So now I've got a sync button on here. Just for fun, I'm going to say, and to kind of demonstrate what I was talking about with that multi-user status, I'm going to say hide object when get multi-user state equals 2. Remember, multi-user state 2 is mean this file is hosted live on the server. So that disappears. And that's another way now that I can tell that I'm looking at the hosted copies, that button disappears. So now we've got the sync button, but none of you guys have it right now, right? Because MirrorSync, even if you run a sync right now, you're going to get new record contents, but we can't sync schema, not yet. I really, really, really hope that one of these days FileMaker will allow us to dynamically modify the structure of a FileMaker file through some API or DDR or something like that. And then we actually will sync schema, which will be freaking awesome. But for now, the only way for you to get a new copy of whatever programming changes I made is for you to get a new copy of the file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into field definitions, and in the MirrorSync table, there's a field here called database version. And actually, this is left over from my sample. I should just make that blank. If I change that to anything different than what it is right now, it doesn't even have to be a number. It can be, but it could be any word. As long as it's something that's different than what it was before. Now, I'm going to go ahead and run my sync and my offline copy. I should get everybody's changes. And I do. I get all the stuff that everybody's added. And now I get a new dialog that pops up here. There's a new database version available named 2. Would you like to replace your current offline file with this version? If I'm busy and I'm talking to customers and I'm in the middle of something, I would probably hit not yet. But if I have time, I'm going to hit OK. And then this stuff is all popping up on my other monitor, so I need to keep dragging it over.
If you hit not yet, will it remind you each time you sync?
Yep. After each successful sync, it'll keep popping up.
Okay.
And now I'll go ahead and log back in. And here's my new offline copy. And now when I go to contacts, I've got a nice little sync button there.
Very nice.
And now it's running the initial sync.
So did that download a new full copy and then it's
It downloaded a completely full new copy. It basically just threw
with all
away
the
my old
records?
file with all the records, with all of the structure and the schema and everything like that that's in there. And so now I am up to date with this new version of the database. So that's kind of how you would manage continued development. Remember, so if you're the developer and you're working on the hosted copy of the database, and preferably you would use a product like our 360 deploy product and work on a development copy, not the live copy. But whichever way you're doing it, it's fine either way, whether you're working on a development copy or the live copy. Let's say you add, 2 new tables. If you add 2 new tables, you're going to want to create 2 new blank layouts named sync_table1 and sync_table2. Let's say you add 5 fields to some of those tables. You don't need to do anything for new fields. MirrorSync will automatically detect them. You change a bunch of layouts, you add some reports, you modify the scripts. When you're completely, and the users will continue syncing oblivious to whatever you're doing on the server because the sync will continue to work. Even though there's new tables and new fields, MirrorSync will continue to sync whatever fields are in common between the offline copy and the hub copy. Once you get to the point where you are ready to deploy that, then you just go in and change that MirrorSync version number, and then the users will get prompted and they'll get that new download. And you guys, if you want to run that, you should be getting the same prompts that I'm getting. So that's my whole demo. That's everything I got. Do you guys have questions on anything?
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah.
It seems I missed a whole bunch.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I did. Sorry. Clients, National Institute of Health.
That sounds important.
You had 3 user scenarios. A high availability fault tolerant was the first one. Client server where the clients have individual copies, which apparently is what we're looking at. What was the middle scenario to use this?
The middle scenario was FileMaker server syncing with a non-FileMaker server database. And SQL Server, Oracle, MySQL, Redshift, DynamoDB, Salesforce, and then any database that has some JDBC driver for it. And so that would be the ideal way, in my opinion, if I was going to run a high volume web application, that's how I would do it. And that's how we have done it. We've done
Yeah.
several MirrorSync implementations syncing to DynamoDB, where we had literally 60,000 simultaneous users. This is for Chicago Public Schools. And it was interesting because they had, they would post their results of who got into which selective enrollment programs Friday, April such and such at 5 p.m. Like everybody hit the set at the exact same time and see what
Yeah.
programs your kid got
Yeah.
into. And prior to us doing that site for them, the previous vendor had done it in MySQL, and it melted down every year Friday at 5 p.m. when they would open the registration.
Wow.
So FileMaker is definitely not going to handle that traffic. MySQL can't handle that traffic, but we did it with Dynamo, and Dynamo like just doesn't even break a sweat. In fact, it was one of my, I'm probably boring you guys now, but this is one of my happiest moments as a professional developer in my career, was when they set up a load balancing simulation and they simulated 30,000 simultaneous users hitting the site. And they sent us, the load balancing company sent a report saying performance with 30,000 simultaneous users was identical to performance with one user.
Wow.
Wow.
I was like, hell yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
So, yeah, that's that middle scenario is kind of like taking your FileMaker database and putting them on a really high performance database engine to host some external site.
Yeah. Yeah. We had a lawyer who had to have index text searches on cases, and we would think they would do in-house in FileMaker, but we had to upload it to SQL to get that, you know, be able to do the indexing of those fields on SQL to be able to do the searches.
Wow.
And you don't do that with ESS. Yeah, you just don't.
Right. ESS is kind of
yeah.
horrifying if you look behind the scenes
Yeah.
at the SQL queries that are being generated. You're like, no, don't do this.
Yeah. You go, no,
Yeah. Well, thank you guys. Let me
Cool.
So-
I did have a question I put in the chat.
Yeah, I love questions.
Did you say something about encryption at rest on the database?
So I did not talk about encryption.
Okay.
If your database is encrypted, that will potentially pose a problem for your users because they're getting a copy of that file downloaded to their offline device.
And
You
they
will
would
need to
the
solve that
encryption.
one of two ways. You will either need to tell everybody your encryption password, which sort of defeats the purpose of the encryption password.
Yeah.
Or, and this is probably the better solution. Remember earlier I talked about the option to have a separate mobile file?
Yeah.
That might be where you might want to consider that, is you take your encrypted server file, you just save an exact same copy of that file. You don't need to, you don't redo your whole database. You just make a copy of that version, you host it unencrypted. And then in that MirrorSync configuration screen, you say, instead of syncing with a copy of the hosted file, you say sync with a separate mobile file, and you point it at that unencrypted version of the database.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't encrypt anything in FileMaker space. I follow FileMaker for years now because there's no such thing as privileged access management in their space. So if you've got a developer that encrypts the database and gets run over by a truck, or goes to Mexico and doesn't come back, or quits or gets fired, and you get the only access to the encrypted database, you're screwed.
Yeah, and I'm not very happy with
I've had all those three scenarios happen. All three of those things.
all three of those scenarios happen. Remind me never to work on a project with you. But I'm not very happy with Claris that on, I believe with FileMaker Cloud, which by the way, MirrorSync does not work with FileMaker Cloud for a variety of reasons, most of which is their data API doesn't work well. But I think in FileMaker Cloud, and this is another problem with MirrorSync and FileMaker Cloud, is that they don't give you a choice to encrypt the database or not. I think FileMaker Cloud requires the databases to be encrypted if you're hosting them with FileMaker Cloud. I like the option to have encryption. I don't like it be mandatory.
If there was a master password, I wouldn't have any problem with it. But I've had to be in situations to try to recover data, one of which was the largest talent agency in the world with over 3.5 million records. And it's a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
I would classify that as impossible. Was it doable? Did you hack the encryption?
Well, in this case, I was able to get around it, but it had to do
Does
with
the NSA know?
I found some records. I found some data that let me get into it. So.
Wow. Wow.
It was so bad that the company, which had been using FileMaker for years and bought half a dozen companies to use FileMaker, they spent millions of dollars to get off it. We lost
Oh, that's a shame.
430 seats, bang, because they just says, we can't risk the company. We can't risk
Wow.
what's going on.
Wow, that's really a shame.
Jesse,
Yeah.
real quick, I also came on late, so I probably missed some of the foundations. But for lack of a better understanding, does it sound like your target audience is those who are looking to scale up their mobile operations with FileMaker and don't have any like server deployment?
No.
Okay,
Yeah, MirrorSync does require asterisk. Hold on, I'll come back to the footnote in a second. But in general, MirrorSync requires FileMaker server. So
okay,
the purpose, this MirrorSync will not sync FileMaker Pro to FileMaker Pro or FileMaker Go to FileMaker Go directly. It's always syncing FileMaker Pro or Go to some hosted server, either FileMaker server, SQL server, etc. It is, and you might have missed this slide, but MirrorSync is capable of syncing to non-FileMaker servers. So you
wow,
could, for instance, sync 100 iPads. And I have a customer who does disaster management where they go and hurricanes have blown down power lines and trees and everything like that. And they take MirrorSync on iPads out and they go clean up the trees. And then they're syncing that directly to SQL Server, not FileMaker Server, which is an interesting
Yeah,
use case.
yeah.
wow, that is just so incredible. I cannot believe that you are operating on a different type of server using FileMaker. Wow,
Yeah, thank you.
so
I mean, it all
cool.
gets passed back as JSON data. So, once we get it on the server side, we can do whatever we want with it.
Yeah.
Cool.
But it is intended as a way of syncing with some shared server, not a peer-to-peer type of sync. And the other use case for it, which is the server-to-server concept. That's what I was kind of mentioning with Kirk. Either a FileMaker server syncing with another FileMaker server
Wow.
for failovers, for clustering, for kind of geographic distribution in multiple cities around the world, or for syncing FileMaker server to a non-FileMaker server database for like kind of high
Wow.
volume web publishing.
So I've got a client, this scenario where they've got 500 users spread across maybe 20 buildings across probably a 30-mile radius.
Mhm.
And some of the performance is abysmal from network. Would this be somewhere we could drop a server in multiple locations and sync them?
Absolutely. Yeah, this would work great. This would work great. And it's not even totally out of the question, depending on the nature of your solution, to just give 500 people offline copies or mix and match. You might have 4 servers for different buildings within the campus, and maybe there's 30 users that are mobile that go all over the place and they want their own offline copies. You can mix and match whatever you want between people who are connected to FileMaker server and people working, on mobile copies, and then have multiple servers. Here is one rule you don't want to break, though. You want to pick one server as your hub. So if you have server A, B, C, and D, don't have A be the hub for B and then B be the hub for C and C be the hub for D. Have A be the hub and B, C, and D are spokes. And then the same thing happens when you've got your offline copies. If you were mixing and matching and you were having some users working on an offline copy, have them use the same hub database that all of the server copies are using. Don't try to daisy chain hubs and spokes off of each other.
So if I had a primary server in a data center, I could put the satellite servers in each of the business units.
Yes. Yes. And that works really well. We've got a similar situation with a company. They're actually all in Southern California, so they're all close to each other. But it's 6 facilities that make parts for race cars, and they have 6 FileMaker servers, and they're all within 100 miles of each other. But they want their on-premise servers, and so they have one of their factories designated as the master, and then the other 5 are all doing replicated syncs to it.
Yeah, that's the same situation here, except they all make parts for military aircraft and Apache helicopters and stuff.
Similar, similar kind of idea, I guess.
So I've got a quick question.
Yeah.
Would it make sense to do like a sync on an opening script, and is there a closing? Is there a way to schedule it automatically?
Yeah.
I'm just envisioning users that forget to sync before they, close the file or whatever.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Is there a way to force that? I don't know if you can run a on window close on Go or. Does that,
So let me address a few of those points differently. First of all, there is a very good way to run a sync on the very first time. When you open a file that's never been synced before, there was an optional step in one of those screens. There was 3 optional steps listed. The last of the optional steps was talking about here's how you can set it up so that MirrorSync will run a sync when you first open the file that's never been synced before.
Mhm.
It's not the same as just doing it in an on startup, because the intention there is not to sync every time you open the database. It's only to do that initial sync if you've never done the initial sync before.
right?
So it's a little bit more, it's a little bit smarter. It does a conditional check to see if the file's been synced before. And if it has not been, then it runs that sync on the first startup. So that's how I would recommend doing it if you want to sync on startup. The idea of syncing, so theoretically, the answer to the question is totally yes. You can run MirrorSync anywhere you can run a FileMaker script, on startup, on shutdown, on a script trigger, on timer, anywhere you can do a FileMaker script. But it's a little disruptive to do it in certain use cases. And I wouldn't personally recommend running a sync on an on timer, because it pops open a little dialog, it commits the
Yeah.
record that they're on, and it might take anywhere between 2 seconds and 30 seconds. And that would really piss me off if I was in the middle of something important and I suddenly had to stop and wait for the sync.
Yeah,
So I think that's the main thing you have to guard against is you can run the sync anywhere you want, but don't put it in a way that's going to annoy your users.
right.
I would try to attach it to some workflow process. Like for instance, if your user is, if they're in an ad agency and there is a button that says, send completed proofs to printer or something like that, maybe that would be the time to kick in the MirrorSync script when they run that process. So I would try to link it more into a predictable workflow where they know when it's going to happen,
Yeah,
rather than kind of something that pops up in their face when they're not expecting it.
So I have another use case to run by you. What about system migration to a different system? I give you a hard example. I got a client that had FileMaker and they decided to move to Enforce Cytoline. Cytoline is all SQL Server based, but it's non-relational. It's all a bunch of flat tables.
Uh-huh.
So they had to, and there were 25 million records in the system they were starting from. And the only way they Cytoline is through Excel, so it was like 2 billion spreadsheets.
Is that a MirrorSync question? That doesn't sound like a MirrorSync question.
Well, yeah, if you were to put MirrorSync between the FileMaker server and the Cytoline system, can you map the stuff? You just map that stuff accordingly and do the data migration. It'd be a one-time MirrorSync, right?
Yeah, you could. We have had cases where we've done one-time data migrations between FileMaker and non-FileMaker servers. If it's non-relational, I don't know if that's going to work really. Does that database have a JDBC driver?
It's SQL Server.
Oh, it's just Microsoft SQL Server.
Yes, except the people that designed it didn't design it as a relational database. They designed the whole flat tables.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that would work. Now, here's an important limitation to be aware of. MirrorSync will not merge or split tables. There has to be a one-to-one relationship. It's okay if the names change, but you can't sync one table in FileMaker to 5 tables in SQL Server or vice versa. So it's not the right tool for a data migration that is also restructuring the schema in a way that is going to merge or split tables. It would be the right tool if you had 35 tables in FileMaker and then you created a 35 table SQL database over here and you wanted to move that data between those. But if you wanted to normalize it or denormalize it or anything along those lines in the process, that would not be MirrorSync would not be the right tool for that kind of situation.
Bummer. Because they budgeted $500,000 to do this, and they're almost $2 million into it, and they still don't have funding. So,
Wow. Well, if you want to talk to us about a custom implementation, let me know.
I'll talk to them. I'm meeting with them this week. So,
Jesse, if you have a light mobile file syncing to the main file on a server, is that done with a script schedule, or is that?
It works. Everything works exactly the same. You would basically copy those MirrorSync scripts into. Now I'm assuming you're talking about a client to server sync, right?
Talking about when you were talking about having a hosted light version of the file, mobile version.
So that light version of the file never syncs with the server, at least not while it's on the server. It's just on the server as a file storage place so that when users request a copy of the file, we have a copy of the file to give them.
Oh, okay.
But there's no actual syncs happening between that hosted mobile file and the hosted main file.
Got
Where
it.
the syncs would happen is after they download the mobile file and then they run their MirrorSync script.
Okay.
Then it would run the sync just like as if it was a copy of the file.
I got it.
Now, if you're talking about a server-to-server sync, then there is an option. Let me jump back to MirrorSync for just a second in my screen share. Now, this would not apply. I'll probably get error messages if I click this box, so I'm not going to. But there's sync, see this sync now button and this auto sync and sync every 60 seconds. That is all, that's not for client to server syncing, but that's all relevant to server syncing. If you were doing server to server syncing, you can either click the sync now button to just run a sync right now, and you'd probably do that during development and when you were doing the initial setup. But once you had it working and the initial syncs were done, then you would come over here and check this auto sync box and you would set some frequency, 60 seconds, an hour, 24 hours, whatever you want. I generally recommend running MirrorSync fairly frequently, at least every hour, maybe more like every 10 minutes or 5 minutes. The more often you run it, the smaller the batches of changes are going to be. So it's really puts less load on the server to transfer 10 records every minute than to transfer 10,000 records a day.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would run that fairly often. And also it's just better having kind of fresh data without all the kind of the latency.
Yeah.
But does that answer the question about the mobile hosted version?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Jesse, just a side note, we've been using the sync server, and the change from 5 to 6 was phenomenal. Yeah, we in 5, we had like, a couple of million records, and it would take maybe 30, 45 seconds per sync. Now it's, 2 to 3 seconds.
Oh
the
my
same
gosh.
thing. It's
That's
unbelievable
wonderful.
difference. Yeah.
That's wonderful to hear. Yeah, MirrorSync 5 and earlier versions use the XML web publishing engine,
Yep.
which was not awesome. The data API is really a big improvement over the XML web publishing engine. And so I think that's really good feedback. It's really good to hear. The big change between 5 and 6, aside from that, is that in MirrorSync 5, every time you changed anything, if you added a field, added a table, deleted a field, renamed a field, anything that you did to the schema, you had to open up the MirrorSync config client, run through the whole thing, and at the end, you had to copy and paste a bunch of script steps into a script because we dynamically generated a script and hard-coded all the field names into it. Now we've switched to using like indirections. Everything's like set field by name and execute SQL. So the string, so everything's dynamic now. So you never change that script. So it used to really be a hassle when you were like syncing a database that was kind of still being actively developed. Now it's much more straightforward to continue to do active development on a system that is also being synced with users. But Ron, thanks for letting me know. That's really great feedback to hear that.
So functionally, this could do the equivalent of what Auto does, right?
I would say that, so we have a product called 360 Deploy, and I think 360 Deploy is a much more closer one-to-one correlation of what Auto does. It would be interesting. So for those that are not familiar with Auto or 360 Deploy, these are tools that will take a development copy of your database, take an empty clone of that, and use the FileMaker data migration tool under the hood to merge the data from your live production database with your new empty clone of your development database. And it's terrific. I still remember the bad old days of FileMaker 5, sitting up all night long, babysitting imports from the production version into my, and I actually had 8 offices that I was doing that for. So I was doing 25 table solution multiplied by 8 offices, and it was basically from like 10 at night till 8 in the morning.
Wow.
Because it had to be done when nobody was working on the database. And so it's it's obviously life-changing that we can now click a button and walk away and those deployments happen automatically.
Yeah.
I don't know if MirrorSync is the right tool for that.
Well, what's the right tool? I just wondered if it was functionally, it sounded like all the pieces were there.
It's kind of in that direction. MirrorSync is more about migrating the data, and you could kind of say, well, we're migrating the data from the old version to this new dev version. I think you'd run into problems with it. And the other thing is that the way that MirrorSync moves data is fundamentally, it's basically using FileMaker script steps. It's new record, set field, set field, set field, new record, set field, set field, set field, new record, set field, set field, set field. Whereas the data migration tool is doing it at a block level under the hood, and it's basically grabbing large binary chunks of data from one and moving it to the other. So I think even if MirrorSync could be rigged to do that, I think it would take you orders of magnitude longer for a large database than it would take with the data migration tool.
But if you were deploying in a client server model with the full version of the software in a client, this is probably a better solution for that then.
Yeah, because in that case, we're just simply lifting the entire copy of the database with all the data in it and just plopping it down. So the user's basically getting the data and the schema in one payload, and there's no sync operations that are happening, unless it's an empty clone, but if it's a full copy, they're getting the data and the file and all of the programming changes as just a binary transfer and not a bunch of scripted set field operations.
So if it's an encrypted one, you just send the non-encrypted copy and then sync. So that's a different process, isn't it?
Yeah, then in that case, you would use an empty clone, and you'd probably pick that option to say do the initial sync on the server, which would make it radically faster. It's still not going to be fast as the data migration tool, but it's going to be a lot faster to sync one file hosted on the server with another file hosted on the same server than it is to sync that file on the server over an LTE cellular data connection to somebody's phone.
Yeah.
Well, let me show you guys just how you can get MirrorSync if you want to try this stuff.
Okay.
So it's mirrorsync.com. This doesn't look very well when I have it small. Hang on, let me move some of my Zoom windows out of the way. Our current version is 6.5. That's the version that we just released that works on Linux. And by the way, I forgot to mention, but it's not just MirrorSync that runs on Linux. Our entire product line we've recently relaunched new versions of all of our products that are now M1 native. They run on Mac, Windows, and now Linux. We're still working on Plastic, Scribe, and SafetyNet. Every single other product besides those three has now been newly released with our newest plugin framework, and they're more reliable, and they run on Linux, and they're really, really fast on the M1 Mac, and so that's great. But this is MirrorSync. Pricing for MirrorSync, you'd click on get a license key if you're using it for the first time. And so there's two components of pricing in MirrorSync. There's configurations and there's devices. Let's not talk about configurations, because for the most part with FileMaker client to server, you don't need configurations. It's just I'm overcomplicating things. So we don't need to mess with this for client to server syncs. We would instead add devices. So MirrorSync comes for free with one device, and that's not a trial. It's not a limit. There's no feature limitations on it. It's not a demo. It's the full thing. The only limitation on it is it's just for one device. A device could be a laptop, a phone, or an iPad. So if you want to set up MirrorSync in your solution and use it for production purposes on one device for free, that's totally awesome with us. We're happy to have you do that. If you want to add more devices, then you come into here and add devices. Here's the pricing. It ranges from $40 to $95 per device, depending on quantity. We also have an unlimited bundle if you need, if you're doing like a vertical market solution thing where you need thousands of devices. Talk to us.
Per year?
Sorry, what's that?
Is that one time or per year?
This is a one-time price.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
And you get one device for free. So let's say you needed 10 devices total. You would add 9 more. The price for 9 devices is $70 each, or for 10. So you wind up at 70 times 9. So that'd be $630 for 10 devices. And so that's the entire pricing model right there. It's just basically a one-time price per device, and the first device is free. We do have an annual maintenance program. It's 25% of the original purchase price. It's optional. If you choose to do it, then you continue to get new versions for each year. If you don't do it, then you keep the software forever. You're just frozen at the version that you have, but it doesn't stop working, and it's not like a rental or anything like that. So you own the software forever once you purchase it. So that is, and then let's talk a little bit about the server to server stuff. So if I were to come here, this is where configurations come in. So this is basically server to server syncs. If I want to sync FileMaker server to FileMaker server, that price is $1,600 per pair of servers. So one hub to one spoke would be $1,600. If you had 4 servers, like in the example you were talking about, Kirk, with the manufacturing, you had 4 servers you want to run. That would be 3 pairs of server: hub to spoke 1, hub to spoke 2, and hub to spoke 3. So that'd be 3 times 1,600. That'd be $4,800 total. And the pricing model is the same. It's a one-time purchase, optionally renew for 25% of that per year to continue to get new upgrades. You can also sync FileMaker server to non-FileMaker server databases. That price is $1,800. So that would be like the FileMaker server to MySQL or FileMaker server to Dynamo or something along those lines. There is kind of an edge case where you might want to do additional client to server syncs, FileMaker server to FileMaker Go. Those are $200 each. There aren't that many of our customers that use that, but where that would come into play is, let's say you wanted to have multiple different buttons that did different things in the sync. Like, let's say, for instance, you wanted one button that's the super fast sync, and it's just a one-way sync from this data collection table to the server. And it's only one table, one way, and it needs to finish in 5 seconds or less. But then you also want at the end of the day or the beginning of the day that you want them to be able to hit a different button that does a bidirectional sync on all the tables. That would be an additional configuration. So that's where the configuration pricing comes in. And that would be $200 per additional configuration, or $1,000 for unlimited configurations. So that's the whole pricing model for MirrorSync. Does that make sense? Do you guys have questions on any of that?
I appreciate that it's not yearly.
I've had both sides of that conversation. Some people have said, I can't believe it's not yearly. Why don't you have a yearly pricing model? I'm like, well, because I don't like yearly pricing. And then some people are like, I really like that it's not yearly. So
Yeah,
I think I'm hearing more feedback in the I like it that it's not yearly. So I think that's probably how we're going to keep it. I remember I use Adobe Lightroom. I do some photography on the side, and I was really pissed off when they got rid of the perpetual licensing. Because I'm like, I don't need the new features. I just want to use the same version I've had forever.
yeah.
But now I have to pay like $29 a month forever.
Yeah,
what really it
started getting really bad when everybody's doing it. Now you've got all these different softwares that you're paying for every year, and it just all adds up.
They just all stack on top of each other.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah, it may seem reasonable for one software. It's like, yeah, that's not so bad. But then when you get 10, now it's bad.
No, it's bad. Well, guys, thanks a lot for having me on. You guys asked a ton of good questions, and that really makes this a lot of fun for me when I'm doing these presentations, is kind of popping between questions instead of just like doing a script.
Yeah, it was a really great presentation, Jesse. I really appreciate it. I think it went really well.
Thank you.
So yeah, thanks for joining us. And
Bev, thanks for saving my ass on that demo. I couldn't figure out why that wasn't syncing.
Thank you, Jess.
All right.
Jesse, when's your next product show and tell with us?
I'm not sure. I'm going to be, we're going to be talking, or I'm going to be on the Richard Carlton podcast talking about 360 Deploy, not Thursday, but next Thursday. And then I'm going to be talking about.
How does it compare to Auto?
I've never used Auto. I know that they do the same things, but I have never installed Auto, so I can't really say what the differences are. I do know from seeing screenshots, Auto is a much prettier product. I will definitely give them that. Like we're not graphic designers, and they clearly are, because their software looks a lot nicer than ours. Functionally, I think ours is pretty damn good. I don't know what theirs might be too. I really don't know. I've just never actually run a deployment.
I use Auto, and it's nice. It's real nice. So
yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think a comparison might be a valuable thing, because Auto's got some good market out there. And if you sell a competitive product, you need to have some competitive analysis.
FileMaker is such a friendly community. This might sound weird, but I actually have always intentionally avoided trying to create products that compete with others. Like 360 Deploy came before Auto. And so I've never really, I can't say never. There's been one or two times, very few times that I've ever created a new product that was an add-on to FileMaker that I felt like that need was already well met within the community.
Right.
And, you know, everybody knows everybody in the FileMaker community, everybody's friends. And I don't really like to say, oh, we're good and they're bad. You know, I just like to say, here's what we do. I feel like we do it well. You know, take a look. But it wouldn't, you're right. It wouldn't hurt to like take a look and have some better answers on that. But I try to shy away from too much. Like, I don't like to trash anybody else's stuff.
That's right.
All right, folks. Well, I think it's about time. We can
I have to do it my own then.
So,
All right. It was a pleasure, guys.
yeah, thanks again, Jesse. Thanks.
Take
All right.
care, Jesse. Thanks for
Thank
your
you.
time.
All right. Thanks. Good to see you again, Stephen.
All right.
Yeah, good seeing
All right.
you as well.
All right. Bye-bye.